Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
Welcome to today's program. We're very pleased to announce that for the next 2 weeks we're going to do a travelogue, and over the years we have found you viewers very interested in that process. We're going to do something we've never done before on travelogues. We're going to go through China and Central Asia, ending in Moscow, following the Silk Road. Two of my very good friends who took this trip in the fall of 2007, they spent a lot of time getting ready to do this, and we have a lot of visual aids for you. We welcome to the program Judy Meyer and Steve Meyer. They are business people in Coeur d'Alene, and they've traveled extensively. And Judy has also served as the former chair of the Idaho Education Board. We've had you here before on your trips. Welcome back. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank
and
you,
as always, I'm pleased to have our regular panelists, Janelle Burke and Erna Reinhardt. And we'll get right to the program because we have a lot to cover, and we'll ask Janelle to ask the first question.
Well, our dear friends, the Meyers, you've had a wonderful trip, and it's been very exciting. You've gone to a part of the world that most of us haven't gone to. Where is the Silk Road? What is it?
We brought with us a map that will help explain where the Silk Road is. There's evidence of objects from Western Europe as far east as Mongolia, 4,000 years before Christ, 4,000 BC. And so the Silk Road, you can see on the screen now, the trade routes were basically from eastern China, which is on your right, eventually through Central Asia, and ultimately some of those goods found their way as far as Venice and Rome, which is on the far left-hand side of the map. Those trade routes evolved from about 200 BC until they were eclipsed by sea routes, which you see at the bottom of the map, which went around India, and that happened about 200 BC. This whole process was not really called the Silk Road until it was named that by a German geographer in 1877. Our next map is a broader picture of Central Asia, and this describes our trip. On the far right-hand side of the screen, you'll see Judy's finger pointing to Hong Kong, and on your left-hand side of the screen, her finger is on Moscow, Russia. We spent 30 days traveling 11,500 miles between those two places. The big pink section you see in the middle is Tibet, and the map is colored by elevation, and that pink color is over 12,000 feet. At the highest point, we were on a railway which was 16,000 feet up. You can see there at the bottom of the screen, part of India. Between the pink and the green is the Himalayas. And then around, as you go to the left, following the pink, is a mountain chain named the Tian Shan Mountains, which is the second highest mountain chain in the world. And then in the middle is an extension of the Gobi Desert, that kind of long green round space. The Gobi Desert has places which are 400 feet below sea level. So we ran the extreme of 16,000 feet above sea level to 400 feet.
And I think we have one other map.
Below sea level. And we have another map which describes or shows the rail routes that we followed from Hong Kong. The little section there just beside Judy's hand on your right is the route down to Lhasa, Tibet, and then across all of Central Asia to Moscow.
Erna Reinhardt.
Welcome to the show, Judy and Steve. It's great to have you here. This was a 1-month trip, so share with our viewers how you actually traveled from point A to point B and where you went.
Okie doke, and I'm happy to do that because Steve loves trains, and he found this trip on the web and said, Judy, let's go do it. And then he said, we get to stay in a train for 30 days. And I said, oh. But it turns out that, and you'll see in some of the next pictures, there's a scene of the train and the train station, which were very modern, very convenient. I'm sorry, before that we should have a picture of Hong Kong, because that's where we started. Then should come a picture of the train schedule, because one of the things
Here's
when you
Hong
do,
Kong,
there's Hong Kong, and what we're showing there is the old building on the left, the old Parliament building, and then the new modern buildings. But so many of you are familiar with China that what we wanted to show you was a train schedule, because we had a little difficulty reading it, so we were glad we were with a group. And so part of the description of what we were doing is we were on a tour with a special excursion train that then traveled, as we described, through China and Central Asia. So the next picture will show you, in fact, the train car I'm peering into, but the next picture will show you me in it, because it's very lovely, very well appointed. Oh, yeah. And there's the compartment we're in, upper bunk, lower bunk, little table. And you must pack lightly because there's not much storage room. Following these pictures will be some of what we toured in China. There I am in the compartment area. In the hallway, the bathrooms down the hall, their shower car. It's well done.
A fun story about this train. The train was built for Chairman Mao when the senior dignitaries of the Communist Party traveled around the country by rail.
So that's what you arranged for me, Steve?
Well, yes.
Okay.
The senior officials now travel by air, and this train's available to be chartered. So it was an 18-car train, and later you'll see pictures of the whole train. And there were about 35 of us on this trip. So we had lots of corridors to walk up and down and look out the window.
I believe you have another series of photographs.
Yes, and we'll move on to those because the next series are some of the early scenes of our trip in eastern China.
And here's one up now, Judy.
Good, and you see here a boat on the Guilin River, and the karst, those big rocky outcroppings, are famous. I'm sure you've seen pictures of that. Note on top of the boat, those orange little squares. The next picture will give you a closer look at those orange squares. And now it's time to guess, what are those orange squares? Those are apricots drying on top of the boat. And so there are many pictures we don't have time to show of all the interesting produce that's growing, especially in eastern China. The next scenes we'll just slide through quickly, show an industrial area. There's the train up on the tracks there on the right, the rural area of growing all kinds of food. Corn here, we're in the fall, so you see the corn bunches there. The next scene will be a farmer in his field by hand, and so we go from the train and good construction of railroad tracks to a laborer with a hoe working in the fields. On from there was a scene of a national park, because we were very impressed with the stone forest. Mm-hmm. Many stories to be told there, but not today, except that China has done a good job with their national parks. And lots of Chinese tourists visiting. It was surprising to us how many. From there should be a scene of our contrast again of the huge industry, piles of coal. The railroad is being used for lots of transportation of freight. And here you see the rural in the foreground. So it was a very contrasting experience as we traveled along. From there we went to Chengdu, a city that's now about a third of the way across China, where they have a panda bear research center. So these are our two buddies that we had fun morning touring through there. Then from there we went a little further north and west to Xi'an, which is the headquarters of the Terracotta Soldiers. And again, so many folks have seen pictures and know of that area that although we had numerous pictures to show you, we have just one more to show the marvelous excavation that has gone on. Every one of those soldiers is individually hairstyled, costumed. It was a Herculean effort that was only discovered in the 70s, I believe, and the excavation is still going on. In the next picture, I think we'll probably wrap up my section of spiel, which was just to show some of the interesting fruits in the fall, the melons, the grapes, dates, nuts. The train provided good food. We also then, with the help of our guides, knew where to eat in the country. Otherwise, you do need to be selective in what you do.
Oh, that was very, very efficient. Thank you so much. Another part of your trip was to Tibet, and
yes.
There's a lot of history there, and I believe there's a high elevation train to Tibet. Tell us a little bit about that part, and we also have some visuals with some photographs.
The Chinese have committed to building a massive industrial infrastructure, which includes railroads. And although we've kind of lost some of that momentum in the United States, the Chinese are spending billions and billions of dollars building railroad expansions. And the next picture shows some of that. One of the fascinating things is that whatever they can do with manpower, with physical labor, they do it. If they need a specialized piece of machinery, it's available, but a lot of physical labor. Here, the railways are built with concrete ties, like we do in the U.S. now, but they're placed by hand.
Let's go to the next photo. We got several to do here.
Yep.
There's a picture on the way west, out toward western China. Tremendous amount of industrialization, as you see there.
Yes.
The next picture is the beginning of the climb up to the Tibetan Plateau. I mentioned earlier that it's average 12,000 feet. It's rolling countryside. Here's, of course, some big mountains, but spectacular, large vistas. The next picture is higher elevations, and you can see it started to snow. If you look carefully, in the center of the picture horizontally is a series of bridges, and over there on the far left you see some very low bridges. About a third of the 1,000-mile route built in the last 5 years
On time and on budget.
from central China to Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, about a third of it was built on permafrost. And the technique there is to build it up on small concrete
They
bridges
have
like
snow
you
all
see
the
there.
time.
Much of the time.
Yeah.
Let's
And
go
then
to the
they
next.
I'm sorry, Tony, we'll move on to the next slide, which we can do,
Yeah.
because that's the interior of the train. But Steve, I remember you teaching me that to permafrost you can't build on, so not only do you elevate it, but you have to dig down 90 feet to get to firm
Get
enough
it
ground
right.
to build the trestle.
Here's a picture of the new railway car, and as you can see, it's modern.
Yes.
This was built just in the last year. This train, because of the elevation, has oxygen in the train
Oh,
cars
that's very good.
Yep. We were
for
glad.
people who might need it.
The next one.
Yep. The next, yes. I asked Steve to take this picture because here's the railroad station. Look behind, there's just nothing out there, a tiny town far away. And then the local folk waiting for the train. I just love the Tibetan folk with their
Yes.
colorful costume and friendly, smiling faces. They were very hospitable.
And the next photograph is
Go ahead. On.
This is Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. It's a city that's now 50% Chinese. The country is filled with contrasts. The Chinese influence, the Dalai Lama's influence, who no longer returns to Tibet.
although he has a desire to do so.
Well,
Yes, he
yeah,
does. The next
he
picture will
does.
show his palace where he is not able to reside now.
This is called
Portola
Portola Palace, which is a gigantic palace.
Go the other way.
Other way. There it is.
There it is.
And
you able
this
to
is
go
a
through that?
nighttime picture, so you can see it's nicely illuminated.
It almost looked
We,
unreal, but it
We
it's
went into
real.
the palace and climbed the stairs to the top, 200 and some steps to the top.
Now remind you, we're doing this at what, 12,000 foot elevation?
Yeah.
right
Next picture shows us climbing up those stairs, and with some other people. There are some Buddhist monks on the left,
there.
and some other tourists.
Thank you very much, Janelle Burt.
Well, where did you actually join the Silk Road? How did you come about being there?
That's a good question, Janelle, because the Silk Road doesn't run from Hong Kong to Moscow. Steve explained the Silk Road started out in segments, and really it was caravans of trade from the east, bringing jewels and gold, and one of the things I read was rhubarb to the west, and from the west to the east was in fact, let's see, how am I doing my geography? It should be east to west was the silk.
The silk went from China to Europe, and spices, and
Right.
from Europe to China, the backhaul, which took 3 years, was gold and silver and jewel items.
We can go to the next picture.
This was not a caravan sort of a thing that you might visualize like an American wagon train.
Or like the movies make it
Or
look.
like the movie.
your photograph.
Yeah,
Well,
okay.
that's a photograph of two
Yaks.
yaks pulling a wooden plow with a steel blade. But
This is on the outskirts of Lhasa, which was a recipient of some of the Silk Road trade,
you know,
but we'll go on from there.
well, the question you want to about the Silk Road that I'd like to speak to is the fact that this was trading from one merchant to the next. Camels can go about 40 miles between an oasis in a day, and so each section of the Silk Road had its own collection of bandits and hoodlums, and so only local people could be successful at it. So the merchandise would go from trader to trader to trader, who might have carried it 100 or 200 miles to the next community, where he sold it to the next guy. And so it took a long time, and it was not an organized thing where some grand trading company bought merchandise in China and sold it 3 years later in Italy. It was simply a series of small trades.
Now we need to go to the next photo.
Yep, the next slide will show what is grown now and surprised us is cotton. And there'll be a couple of pictures here showing cotton, which is on the ground there, and they're sorting it out. I think the next picture will show a cotton blossom that we were just practicing. Tony from the south, you've probably seen that before.
I thought that was the only place they grow cotton.
Well, and that surprised us because that's a new product. It's not
Yes.
one that was done on the Silk Road. I think the next picture shows the bales of it because, in fact, a new Silk
Yes.
Road is shipping cotton now, and this was really developed when Russia oversaw some of the Central Asian countries, and we'll be talking about some of that later on. But that scene, at least, was one that reminded us of the trade that the Silk Road did, and the value of the Silk Road back when it was trading silk was that in 46 BC, Rome then did receive the silk that was traded, and the local. Quite if there were newspapers were written on rocks, but the story was from the Romans they were fussing about the use of silk, that it was costing too much money to get it there. That Julius Caesar had silk canopies for the first time and was pretty providing pretty extravagant inauguration when he was leading Rome. So we laughed as we learned about the Silk Road and where it goes, that not only did it go towards Rome, but it also sent products north towards Moscow and south into India. Those countries, as the Silk Road was going through them, Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, all these Central Asian towns, were individual fiefdoms, kingdoms. They were emirs. They were all fighting each other. It was not a friendly time, and it was difficult to get the trade through there. And for me, I just didn't know where those countries were. I didn't know how to spell them. I knew they were sort of, how big is Western China? Well, it's so huge that I was really surprised then at all the other country that's still there, which borders to the Caspian Sea.
I bring you about 3 more pictures under Janelle's question here.
Okay, let's see. I think we've covered most of them. Oh, let's go ahead to the next picture, which shows some of the, this was in fact some of the old Chinese Great Wall, because we're now in Western China getting ready to go into those Asian countries, Central Asian countries, where the Silk Route was going. And so, Janelle, this scene represents a section of wall that still remains. And the wall was built different places, different times. It's not the same as the Chinese wall we're used to seeing.
And I think we have a couple more here that
Yep.
you want to show.
Because the next one I wanted to show you is a typical oasis, Dunhuang, and that's where the cotton was being grown now. But at that time, as a trading area, it's one of the few cities that hasn't been blown over with sand dunes and lost in the desert, because the desert was a very difficult area to go through. So you see the trees there that remain and were there then, and it was a source of water and a great trading center that was active for years, centuries.
Next picture was a place called Turpan, or near Turpan, where there are ruins left from an old city. And we saw so many of these that I've forgotten how old it was, but old.
Old. Old city.
And the next one,
Erna Reinhardt, I believe, has got a question.
Oh, sorry. Sure.
Erna?
Share with us what this is.
this was fascinating. Our guide was hungry, and so we found a street vendor who's making naan, which is flat bread. So there's a guy rolling out the dough. This fellow was squashing it in the orange bowl there, which is filled with chopped up onion. And then inside that circular thing on the right, he was slapping it on the wall. There was a fire in the bottom of that, so that's an oven. And so he would bake this flatbread while you stand there and pull it out with that little handle you see, or that wire rod. And I think it cost a nickel. And so we ate it hot out of the oven, and it was a marvelous experience.
Very fresh. So now in this part of the slideshow, we're starting to go through the desert area, and you're still in Western China, I believe. So share with us some more slides from that area, and share with us how you were treated through that area of the world.
Next slide, I think, will set the scene for what is now, as you can see, Western China has some heavy industrial areas, still quite a desert area, because we're really in the Western China, where in fact the atomic testing was conducted because it was Western China. And also where folks who didn't think politically the way that China thought they ought to think were offered hospitality, which was sent out to Western China. And when we landed in Hong Kong, and the guy talked to us about where are you going, and we said Western China, he said, oh, to the frontier. He hadn't really, it was like when we settled the United States. The East Coast has lots of development, and the West Coast does not. So this slide here represents the most western city in China, Kashgar. And for folks who know a little bit about the Silk Road, this is one of the more famous and oldest markets in that whole section of the world. Steve took this picture. Why did you take that, Steve?
I took the picture not because of that critter hanging on the left, but because of the contrast that is kind of our theme of the lady in the center in the black leather jacket and her high heels and her tiny little motorcycle.
Wow.
But although parts of China are very poor, there are other parts which are very prosperous, even in the frontier.
And look at the high fashion black leather coat there. And then behind are the adobe. Most of the buildings, remember in the desert, would be built out of the adobe blocks
And
like
I think
that.
we have 3 or 4 more pictures here.
Let's look at the next one. This is a street market. The picture is here because of the lady in the burqa with her face covered. Behind it you see metal parts that were fabricated right there on the street and for sale. Those are stoves for a house.
Go ahead.
And the next one is a
yeah.
couple of distinguished gentlemen who
Yes.
are discussing politics, I bet.
Well, and they also, Steve, reminded us about the heritage here. These were Russian men. And one of our group spoke Russian and began to visit with them because Central Asia then has been organized originally just by tribes and lots of fighting during the Silk Road time. But now they have established their own countries, but in between, Russia oversaw them. And so Russian is the common language. Russia introduced the transportation of the train, this common language, and really a lot of good public service, water, clean water, those kinds of things, to this ancient city of Kashgar or Kashi. Sometimes it's hard to read the map because it's spelled the Russian way. It's spelled the Kashgar is in western China, so the Chinese way, or the original folks over there from Kazakhstan area. And so sometimes we weren't always sure how to read the signs or what they meant. But these gentlemen were just very hospitable, and we were treated very well. As you ask about that, we were aware we were American, and this is a more politically concerned area, but never did we have any difficulty at all. The women were eager to visit. I'll have some slides later on about women visiting with us and eager. They wanted to be photographed with us, especially if you were tall. There was one fellow on our tour who was a retired Lutheran minister, and he was very tall. And people, and especially in China, would just rush right over and ask, what is your name? How old are you? And can we take your picture? I don't know what else they spoke, but they had those three phrases say that.
Don't we have a couple more photos?
We have one more, Tony,
Just one more.
Okay.
which is a market scene.
Again, the same city of Kashgar.
Same city in Kashgar. Somebody bringing produce to be sold.
And this really was what this market was all about, was the exchange both from Silk Road days and still today for bringing together all the products made not only in this area, but the exchange of products from Kashgar. The routes went north, south, east, and west, as I recall, into India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. We're not that far from
The
Afghanistan.
city is about 200 miles from Afghanistan, maybe a couple hundred miles north of the Himalayas, mountains all around.
So this was a respite.
And
When they came out of the mountains and landed here, the traders were very grateful to be there, alive.
We've got some more time, but the good news is you're back next week, and we're going to continue this journey. But those photographs and your comments brought to my mind a really interesting, I hope, question. China is still under the People's Republic of China is still under the communist control. The Soviet Union has collapsed, and you have the different breakdowns. You have Russia, of course, and you have Georgia and different ones. And so I can understand why travel there, as we look at next week, would be different. But I'm really interested in the fact that is China still under the communist control opening up, particularly encourage tourism. You spent a lot of time there. Is it different? It would have been, say, 10, 15 years ago to go? Or they welcoming tourists more? And
Oh, thank you, Tony, and both of us would probably want to speak to that. Certainly for me, who was interested in women's issues and education issues, we'd not been to China before. So we were delighted with the guides who would answer any question we asked. They were open to and talking about family planning issues that they're struggling with in China. Steve was always asking about economics and the geopolitical world, and I'll let him speak to that. But our experience was very positive, very open, and stunned, even though we'd read so much about what China was doing and how they were growing. To see what they were accomplishing was just stunning. I was thinking I knew and still astonished.
Steve, you have that same experience that they would want to talk with you and discuss these issues?
They were open and curious, although many Chinese speak English. They're not comfortable doing it. So some of that was a little hard. But China, to me, was just a revelation in what a modern place it is. The Chinese are on their 17th five-year plan. One of the few remnants that was very conspicuous to us of the communist government was their five-year planning cycles. But for 80% of the business in China is conducted by small businesses or corporations that are privately owned or or publicly held. I mean publicly held by shareholders, not by the government. So there's been a huge transformation.
So there's some introduction of private enterprise ideas in
Oh,
China.
enormous introduction of it, Tony. And
What was the company you saw?
well,
in
we were
Kunming?
looking in a magazine article in Xi'an, which is a town of 7 million people, and it listed the top employers, like we'd see in the local newspaper. The biggest employer in town is KMC. And in the top 10, number 4 was Micron from Boise, Idaho. I mean,
Never get away from having your connections.
well, that's right. You have to behave everywhere you go
That's the
because you
real
might
hard
run into
part.
somebody you know.
Yeah.
But the competitive threat that China represents, China graduates 500,000 engineers a year. We graduate less than 200,000 in this country. And so if you just think about the scale, they've got 1 billion people there. It's a market economy that doesn't consume as much as we do because they save more, but it's just going to be an enormous influence in our lives.
They also are probably very pleased that they've loaned us a lot of money. I
Yes?
saw recently that it's really large figures of what we have borrowed from China. Unfortunately, when you do a 30-minute program, it always comes to an end too early. But the great news, ladies and gentlemen, is that our guests are going to be back with us next week, our wonderful friends, Steve and Judy Meyer. And we shall continue this journey that they took, which is a very, very long one, in which they traveled over 11,500 miles across China, Central Asia, ending up in Moscow. And we're going to continue that trip. We have a lot more visuals to show. And I didn't say at the beginning of the program what I want to say now, and that is most of us will never be able to take this trip for lots of reasons or schedules. And what our good friends are doing for you is they're taking you on their trip when they came home through their slides and through their experience. And I certainly want to invite you back next week when we will continue this 11,500 mile journey that they took with other people, as I've said, through China, Central Asia, and ending in Moscow. It's a place that not too many Americans have gone in the past. So I hope you'll be with us again when we will continue that program with them. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.